This one really is going to encompass a few videos that I've already where I've already discussed these issues, but I think it's an all-encompassing video, and I think it's very important, even if it is a little repetitive. I think it's relevant, and I think these are points that do need to be reiterated. So we have China, the country. We have the Chinese Communist Party, which runs that country. And actually, I say China, the country. There's the People's Republic of China, and then there's Taiwan, or as it would be officially known in Olympic circles, for example, as Chinese Taipei, which is a contentious term in itself. So then that even gets into the issue of what is actually the legitimate China. There is a strong case to be made that the big China, the People's Republic of China, doesn't actually have legitimacy because of some of the things that were going on at the time of the Chinese Civil War. But anyway, that's a long history. For simplicity's sake, well, when I say China, I'm talking about the People's Republic of China. Then there's the Chinese people, the Chinese diaspora, there's people who are of Chinese descent. Um, so it's very, very important that we understand all these things, at least on some level. Um, there's been more reports of racist incidents against people of Chinese descent, and every time I see these things, I'm disgusted by it. I mean, racism's always disgusted me of any kind, particularly that sort of vitriolic, physical racism. It's one thing someone saying something unpleasant online, but that actually manifests itself in physically abusing people or even a physical attack is reprehensible. And I reiterate, it's whatever people feel about the Chinese government, there's absolutely no excuse for that. But, I honestly think that the sort of racist thugs who are doing this, and that's what I call them, if you violently attack a stranger, that's what you are, you're a thug. But I actually think that they're not really motivated by any sort of ideological opposition to the Chinese Communist Party or any sort of concern about human rights. It's a very basic sort of resentment. They see what's happening in the country. We've now had over 30,000 deaths, and in other countries as well, over 72,000 in the United States. They see these things, they feel angry, um, but unfortunately, they're taking out that resentment on the wrong people. They're taking out on people of Chinese descent or Chinese nationals when they should be focusing their anger on the Chinese government. I have no problem with people being angry with the Chinese government. In fact, I think there should be more anger towards the Chinese government. But it is so important that reasonable people not only denounce this stuff, but recognize that it has to be denounced. But in doing that, it is also very important that people do not conflate criticism of the Chinese communist regime with the racist attacks. And one thing that some on the left have been doing, and we've seen this on both sides of the Atlantic, is they conflate legitimate resentment at the Chinese government, opposition to the Chinese government, which might include strong language about the Chinese government, as equating to anti Chinese racism. The Democrats have been playing this game on some level. I mean, now Biden's talking tough on China because he's realizing that it's politically important to do so. But I've said before that the Democrats it's legitimate to condemn racism and condemn racist incidents against Chinese Americans or Chinese nationals, but they have to make it clear that it is legitimate to criticize the Chinese government. And I think there is a problem here in that too many people think that they conflate the racism with the criticism. Sometimes it may cross over, but that's very dangerous because all that does is play into the hands of the regime to put out the message that Western foreign policy is racist against China, which in my opinion it isn't. I think analogies with for example, the Chinese Exclusion Act of the Chester Arthur administration are not helpful because the context is totally different. I mean, in the late 19th century, there was some awful discrimination against Chinese nationals. There were full-on massacres. such as the 1871 lynching of between 15 and 20 Chinese men in Los Angeles, and there were other similar atrocities, which in the Western United States was just as brutal as what happened to African Americans in the Deep South. Um, so there is a history of racism there, but that doesn't mean that there isn't also legitimate criticism to be made of of the Chinese state. The problem is, as I see it, a lot of Chinese themselves don't differentiate between, for example, verbal abuse against Chinese nationals versus criticism of the regime. They buy into the CCP propaganda line that it is one and the same, that if you criticize the Chinese government, then you're anti China. And how the Chinese government looks at the world, they crudely divide it into groupings of anti China or pro China. And in a way, Western countries, they can say they're not against the Chinese people, but we're going up against a very, very powerful propaganda system. And, you know, you could get into the semantics of it if you oppose the Chinese government. I mean, in a sense, it's anti-China because in terms of vernacular usage, when we're talking about countries, really we're talking about the government. I mean, you could say, okay, it's not the Chinese people, it's not Chinese culture. Although, with the wet markets, I do think there's some legitimate criticism to be made of aspects of Chinese culture. And it has to be understood that that is not the whole. China is a huge country and there's not a single homogenous culture there. It varies greatly from province to province. I can say that from experience. For example, the cuisine in the north of China is very different from the south and the west. So when we see the more extreme sort of cuisine, that tends to be more in the south. I mean, I could make a whole video about that. So is it also important that that's understood? Because if people just assume, the Chinese just eat dogs, I think that can lead to racism. It can lead to a dehumanizing of 1.4 billion people. Like they're all savages, basically, to put it bluntly, and that's dangerous because it's racist, obviously, but it's also actually inaccurate. There is growing hostility within China against some of these practices. For example, there was a big backlash against the Yulin Dog Festival. So, and I know, having spoken to my colleagues over there at the time when I was there, that there's not this wholehearted endorsement of some of the things that go on there. In fact, there's outright opposition to it. Maybe not as much as there should be, and certainly I hope there's a big backlash after all of this. But um, it's very, very important that people understand that when we're talking about China and the Chinese, that's not a single definition. So, for example, there are people who are second, third generation. The grandparents came here from Hong Kong and Guangdong, Canton as it then was. Um, so they're British Chinese people. And in many cases, they're very, very, those who are political, not all of them are, but those who are political tend to be very anti CCP and very pro Hong Kong. I mean, certainly young Hong Kongers hate the CCP, perhaps more than anyone. Um, so, for a Hong Konger, for example, to suffer racial abuse, these racist thugs, they're not going to stop and think, oh, are you a supporter of the CCP or not? They'll just look at their appearance and think, oh, Chinese, let's attack them. So that's disgusting and it needs to be opposed. But I also think it's very, very important that we forcefully stand up to these useful idiots. And I'm afraid I've no respect for them. I'm not talking about Chinese propagandists, but I'm talking about Westerners who can't tell the difference, who actually say that it's one and the same thing. They're just being very, very naive, and all they're doing is enabling the Chinese state. Incidentally, today I'm wondering, is China starting to cave in a little bit to international pressure? Because up to now they were outright refusing any sort of inquiry at the World Health Organization. Now they're saying that not until we've beaten the virus. One spokesman claimed that we're not totally allergic to the idea of an inquiry, but we're not going to do it from a politicized witch hunt. Well, they can say that they want it to be led by medical personnel and scientists, but look at their track record of medical personnel and scientists. It's not a good one, it's one of threatening them, and they need to be publicly reminded of that. One of the things that frustrates me most about Western foreign policy, or I'll be a bit more specific, British foreign policy, because I think the Americans and the Australians, and to a lesser extent the Canadians and the New Zealanders and the French, have been more outspoken than we have. One thing that really frustrates me is we will not publicly say what needs to be said. We will not publicly challenge the CCP's lies. So, for example, why do we not publicly condemn their threatening of the doctors early in this crisis? Of course, they'll deny it. They're professional liars. That's no excuse for us not to say what needs to be said. And you might argue it's not diplomatic. Frankly, we're at a point where normal diplomacy is not going to work. This mentality that we've had for a long time of sort of, well, diplomacy will just solve everything. Diplomacy absolutely should be exhaustively used, but that doesn't mean that diplomacy always has to be sugar-coated. I do believe that there is such a thing as blunt diplomacy, blunt talking diplomacy. It doesn't mean saber rattling for the sake of it. It means telling the truth. It means saying what needs to be said. Um, and I feel that the way my country has approached China in recent years has been utterly lackluster. There's been murmurings of opposition. There's been murmurings of let's do something, but it's just not enough. Nowhere near enough. If the Johnson administration doesn't do something fairly soon, and certainly coming out of this crisis, it would be unforgivable. It really would. I mean, he looks up to Winston Churchill in history. He might actually go down as a Neville Chamberlain. And people might say that's a crass analogy because China is not the Third Reich. China under the CCP is not the Third Reich. Well, short of starting a world war and committing a genocide and killing 6 million people in recent years, millions have died under Chinese communism. That's no hyperbole. Um, Make no mistake about it, this is a regime that has killed millions of its own people. This is a regime that continues to behave in a way that just should be unacceptable to any sort of moral conscience at all. And I think it's Chinese power that protects it. Basically, the second most powerful country in the world. Although that doesn't mean its power is unlimited. But I just think it's very important that when we're talking about these things, I mean, it's personal for me because that country's been a huge part of my life. I lived and worked there twice. I'm still in contact with most of my Chinese friends. Never talk to them about these issues because I don't want misunderstandings online where you can't have a face to face. And yeah, it's an uncomfortable thing for me if I'm being totally honest. I'd love to have a very candid conversation with my friends, but frankly, some of them, when you're a product of that society, even if you're a decent and intelligent person, it's such a powerful thing to be taken in by that sort of jingoism, especially when the perception is the whole world's against your country. That does get a sort of, it's almost like, let's say you have a family member and you can't stand them, but you'll still defend them to outsiders. I think a lot of Chinese have that mentality. They don't necessarily love their government, but they'll still defend it because I've seen people claim that they're not pro CCP, but they'll still have this mentality of oh, but you're anti-China. So there is an extreme nationalism at play here, which we can't underestimate. So yeah, I reiterate everything I said. I think we need to stand up to the Chinese state, absolutely, and I think now is the time to do it. I think we need to back our allies in doing this. We need to back the Australians. Um, I mean, the more I think about the arrogant way the Global Times dismissed Australia, don't forget Australia, the Royal Australian Navy helped in the search effort for MH370, as a humanitarian gesture for the victims of that disaster. That was Australia helping the Chinese people. So when a Chinese jingoistic editorial lashes out at Australia, they should remember that. I think it's very, very important that we understand these different terms. Chinese government, China, the country, which can mean in certain contexts referring to the Chinese government, or it can mean China, the country. I think it's fair to say, if we're talking in a political sense, the Chinese policy that refers to the country, um, and the Chinese people. And the Chinese people, there are mainland Chinese, there's a Chinese diaspora, some of whom are second, third generation, um, people who've come over, whose grandparents, great grandparents came over from Hong Kong and Guangzhou and Fujian province. Um, and then there is, mainland Chinese who are in the West, either as international students or tourists or business people. Probably not tourists at the moment, but let's say students and business people. Um, I've got Chinese friends in other countries. Some of my closest friends are in Germany, and whilst the people in question haven't had personal hassle, they've heard of people who have. And of course, I would be very concerned and angry if something happened to them. Um, but I would also challenge anyone, including my friends, if they were to come out and say that the world's picking on China, because I don't think that's what's happening. I think this is a crisis that the Chinese state has created with their lack of transparency, with their jingoism, and with their authoritarianism. No, their totalitarianism. Anyway, these are very, very important things. But the racist thugs that are doing this stuff, I really don't think they're that political. I think they're just opportunistic thugs. I think they don't like the lockdown, they don't like what they're hearing on the news, but they are just lashing out at anyone of an Asian appearance, whether they're Chinese or not. And it's wrong. No one should have to go through that because of something that's beyond their control. But on that point, and I'll close with this, China itself is not immune from racism. There's been reports that black Africans have been subjected to racist abuse in Guangzhou. Chinese social media is extremely racist toward outsiders. So, when we're talking about anti Chinese racism, let's not overlook that there's also a lot of racism coming from China and from Chinese netizens. I mean, it's really quite extreme stuff. So, this works both ways, and that's particularly galling. That they would think that they could point a finger at anyone when this began in their country. I've heard reports about people actually holding their nose as Nigerians walk past in Guangzhou. That's disgraceful. Um, I'll leave it there, but these things really, really need to be understood. When we're talking about China, that can mean the Chinese government. When we're talking about the Chinese people, we need to be a bit more careful. I'm absolutely against any sort of collective punishment. However, I do think that if Chinese nationals come to the West as tourists or business people or students and they're going to defend the Chinese government, they can't really complain if there's a hostile response. I'm not saying there should be a racist response, but put it this way, if a Chinese national in the West wants to debate with me, I'm not going to hold back on what I think of the communist regime and what I think of their personal attitude, because that's arrogant to go to another country and basically fly your flag in that sort of way. And people might say that's ironic coming from a Britain, but the empire is a long time ago. So that's what we're seeing from some Chinese. There is an arrogant nationalism at play. But there's also this racist abuse, which is utterly, utterly wrong. Okay, leave it there. But people just need to think about these things.